So I'm here representing the Artifacts company, and we're working in the art field. We're covering primary and secondary art market, and surprisingly enough, we're doing some machine learning and AI there. And I think I will be mostly focusing on slightly different topics than the rest of the team, and I'm probably representing the smallest company in the whole conference here. But yeah, otherwise, yeah.
Thank you. I'm Camila Lombana. I'm an expert researcher for AI ethics and governance in AI for SAP. And we've been kind of experimenting for the last 4 years on how to bring regulations and principles, especially human rights, to our engineering and developer teams. And yeah, happy to be here.
Hey, I'm Florian from Gina AI, and we focus on so-called search foundation. So there are these AI models everyone currently talks about, but this is just one category of all the AI models that exist, and there exist AI models specifically for search, and this is where we focus on.
Fantastic. And today we'll be covering a number of subjects around large language models, their applications, industry trends, but I think also most importantly, what these experts are seeing coming around the corner. I think with the growth and explosion we've seen from machine learning and AI in the last 2 years, I think we can all encounter that it's about to keep moving with momentum, and I think keeping ahead of these trends has become really difficult. To kick things off, and I think a really good introductory question, is a number of organizations are quoting that the future is looking like large language models and LLMs. In particular, Gartner recently announced that 80% of organizations will have a large language model in production by 2026. That's a really interesting statistic. It beats the adoption rates for things like mobile, things like crypto, things like wearables. And actually seeing this explosion come into fruition, I think what's really interesting is actually what use cases, what problems are you seeing Gen AI solving inside your areas? Anyone would like to start?
So yeah, there's definitely an explosion of companies trying to use AI. So, but most of the experiments, I think, fail or are not so innovative. So a lot of companies also trying to have a chatbot that answers questions for their customers, or have a RAG-like application where people can talk to their data and so on. But also a lot of companies realize it's very hard actually to build these kind of services on their own. I think where the most productivity or the most improvement comes from are all these very small tasks like email templating or asking ChatGPT a question to make you more productive, or code generation to improve your output. I think this is where we see the biggest impact right now.
They're all kind of augmentation type use cases, right? They're not where you're leaving the large language model to be independent. It's actually a lot of that's human supervision. Do you think that's important for getting ROI out of the problems we're solving right now? Is that you have a human in the loop?
I think for most cases it's not possible to have no human in the loop, right? For code generation, for instance. So there was a time when Gina AI developed a code programmer, actually a team of agents that collaboratively create code. Was shortly after ChatGPT API got released. So it was one of our first ideas. So we came from our open source search framework and thought about how can we use this AI technology to improve our product, and it was creating this programming agent. And it turned out it's a very hard task. So there are these apps called Automagical, and this is the trap where we went to, where the user just gives one instruction, and then you expect the entire program to be written completely. And you wait half an hour, and then it kind of worked, but it didn't work in the way you intended it to work. So after this half an hour, you have to reformulate your instruction. Wait again, half an hour, wait again. And these long feedback loops are really annoying, and people don't like this. And therefore, you need human in the loop, but also you need human like directly in the loop, directly interacting with these AI applications, like in a co-pilot way.
That's really interesting. Camilla, do you want to pick that
Yes,
up?
I wanted to just to because at least in SAP or from the European regulatory stand, human in the loop is not a choice. It's not something that you may or not have on your AI systems, but it has become a requirement. And the reason why human in the loop has to become a requirement is because we know that there are huge limitations on these technologies. I guess everybody here in the room understands that there are not only hallucinations. Hallucinations can be super, in very nuanced forms that can carry humongous risk in your business processes and in different pillars, right? Not only from fairness and discrimination purposes, but also, for example, financial, right? It could be that you are assessing an automated use case in finances and it's just by 1 point hallucinating one figure. So the safety and the security topics that this can carry out are too high of a risk not to have a human in the loop always being designed into your processes and your use cases.
I think that's really interesting, showing the parallelism between actually getting the workloads to be effective and then actually getting them to abide by the regulations and produce meaningful results. I think, Nikita, I'd love to get your point of view, particularly from a startup scale-up point of view. How can you make sure that the applications you're building are effective, and how can you make sure you're taking on these practices even when you're a small company?
Yeah, so for us, we're kind of a special case. So first of all, art market is weird because there are not too many regulations happening there because nobody cares. But we have still the customers, we still have the artists. And when it comes to them, they do care and they completely bombard us with whatever's going on. So if you are afraid of any regulatory body, that's nothing in comparison to an artist who has just seen that we estimate now his price lower than a day before. In this respect, we completely rely on basically, we have a panel of experts who have like extensive experience in selling the art, and they are constantly revising what the results of our work. So I constantly have somebody behind my back and saying like, no, this is not going to fly. This is not going to fly. So in our case, it's implemented like this. But again, we're extremely small company, and it's not possible to automate it. I wanted to just use this opportunity to put a little bit into perspective of where LLMs are actually, in my view, and please feel free to disagree with me at any point. Just by the show of hands, how many people have LLM in their company now or using them? Okay. And of those who showed up their hands, how many used any language models before ChatGPT came about? So approximately half, as far as I understand. This is actually an interesting trend because if we cast our mind back a little bit, so we had this computer vision, which started developing like, I don't know, 70 years ago. And it really got a boost when DALL-E was released a couple of years ago. Now, most of you don't even remember the DALL-E. So we are not using it. So I think the major articles in NLP came out in 2015 or so. So now the NLP got a massive boost with LLMs and ChatGPT. And I suspect that the next one will actually be the machine learning with graphs, so graph neural networks. And it kind of makes sense because you are going from two-dimensional images to one-dimensional text to zero-dimensional graphs. So just to put it into like what we have behind, like beyond the horizon.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and I think we're all trying to find these new mechanisms for making these processes scale. And realistically, large language models, particularly in the consumer space, 2 years old.
Yep.
In the research space, less than 5. And I think it's becoming really interesting, actually, that the community, particularly the open source community, are providing a lot of these frameworks. Then I also think, actually, I think to Camilla's point, things like the EU AI Act is actually becoming some of the boilerplate that companies are starting to build their internal processes around, starting to align with. And I think it's good that we have this industry that can help guide other members of the industry. I think to jump into one of those EU AI questions, actually, is we're looking at a bank run of what would be the EU AI Act, a lot of individual local nations introducing AI regulations, that facing against an existing world of data regulations that definitely isn't shallow. I think it's becoming really interesting how companies are starting to manage this process through. What are some advice you would give to the members of the audience who have to adopt these new regulations, but may not have the width of resources to be able to do so at scale?
Okay, so I think it's important to see all of these AI ethics booms, AI ethics debate from different perspectives. So one thing are the recommendations that non-governmental organizations are bringing to the market, such as the UNESCO recommendations, OECD recommendations, etc., that are non-binding documents, but that help SMEs and that help startups go through the process in a way that is compliant to what? To human rights. Because I think what we really need to understand is that we already know the risks of implementing these technologies. Recently, this week, they are consolidating also the Californian regulation of AI. And in there are a lot of topics in order of systemic risks of AI on large language models, for example. So I think that is from one side. Now, the other side is obviously everything that has to go with regulatory spaces. And these regulatory spaces, they are obviously under a defense of citizen rights. And under the AIU Act, which would be the first ones ever, historically, for anybody working in digital technologies to really have to challenge themselves to be creative and innovative around this, right? Because we all want to build good products. We don't want to build engineering products that are mediocre. And in a way, they are, because we cannot right now grow AI technologies to the global south because they can cause systemic risk for certain individuals. So I think it's important to have this awareness and to understand that regulations are not there to stop the development of AI, but they are there to guide it in a way that it's compliant and that it makes also the engineering field actually better, more mature, so that everybody, that we have products that are there for everyone. And under the AIEU Act, what is also very important is to understand what are the classifications of these use cases, right? Because not all use cases are high risk. The idea of these regulations is not to ban the technology, but to guide the technology in what could be a high risk and what not. And from there on, then building on top.
May I have a follow-up? May I have a follow-up question? So, with the regulatory acts, so they're probably lagging behind the technology. And how possible it is that they are reflecting the current state of affairs? Because the new technology comes out today, tomorrow somebody misuses it to do something horrible, but only 3 days later, the regulatory authorities are actually able to do something to counteract it.
I think it's on both sides, right? I mean, yes, I mean, if we think about maybe politicians, that's something else. They maybe be behind the technology. But you have big, for example, in the parliament, you have a group of experts that is called the High-Level Expert Group for Artificial Intelligence, which have created the guidelines for the AIU Act. And there are, big groups also in Singapore, India, as well, which are reflected on engineer capacities in order to create these regulations. It is true, though, that this technology is moving humongously. For example, I know later there will be some questions on open source. That also is a topic in terms of regulations. But I think we're all learning how to build an ecosystem that makes a technology more sustainable for everybody, and it has to come from both sides, from the human factor sides and from the engineering sides. It cannot be divided.
I think that's a really good rebuttal. And actually, I think just to highlight some of those points for the audience, is I think there's some really interesting opportunities for collaboration when everyone's working to the same level of standard. And actually, I think also some opportunities for acceleration for companies starting completely fresh on the page. Some of these standards and guidelines could be a path to be able to give them frameworks for best practice. I think that's really interesting. Florian, what do you think on the current state of AI ethics, particularly someone who's building, I guess, like client-focused applications?
So I think ethics and AI is orthogonal to each other. So I think it should be possible to develop AI technology without any regulations. And yeah, so I think it's good that the AI Act regulates the use cases and not the technology itself, at least not so much. So there's certain limitations on maximum compute that can go into your system and stuff. And this threshold can be adjusted, so I'm quite happy with this. But in general, I think this is not so much responsibility of technological people thinking about ethics. And I think they are also not especially good in this task. So let's leave this to people who study philosophy and stuff.
That might be one now.
Okay. Actually, my mother is calling.
All good.
Okay.
But I think some really interesting points there. Really, really interesting points that actually play a little bit, again, of devil's advocate to some of the standards. Let's jump into, I guess, out of large language models, and let's look at some of these other models.
May I add something? I'm sorry. Before
I'll let you round
jump
out.
on that point, because yes, I agree. There are philosophy is a whole topic on itself, right? And you have years in order to study philosophy and become an expert on that, and also to become an expert in engineering. However, what I do see that there is a lack right now, or a gap on at least on the engineering life cycle, is understanding, because I totally agree that engineers have too much responsibilities to end up a sprint, and they have, I don't know, quality checks and security checks and things and so on. And putting the pressure to engineers to also understand what human rights are and what are the human rights that can be hurt by the thing that they're developing, I think it's too much to put on just one role. However, what I do think that is missing, and I think, I don't know what the future lies, at least on 10 years, but what we're trying to do, at least on SAP, is to adapt the life cycle, the engineering life cycle, into an expansion of human factors that are not yet there to in consideration. So historically, you had accessibility, you have ergonomics, points that, you know, historically even engineers were against to do, right? And now we are bridging into a gap where we're saying, no, it's not only about accessibility and human factors, it's also about, and ergonomics, it's also about the pillars that can also be discredited on the development of your use cases. So I think it's an interesting pivoting place where I guess new collaborations in the cycle will come, and where engineers maybe will need to learn how to collaborate or to co-create with these people that have those expertise. Yes.
I would like to have a word in defense of engineers.
No, I mean, I wasn't meant to trash anybody.
No, but this is a very serious topic, actually. So I'm one of those lucky guys who could exclude gender from our price prediction model, which is cool. And you know why it was allowed I was allowed to do that? Like, any guesses? Because it didn't. It had very low predictive power. I bet if I lost, if the model lost like, I don't know, 5 to 10% in predictive power just because of that, my company wouldn't go with this. But because we lost nothing, they just like, yeah, okay. And then we can basically say like, yeah, we're great. We're equalizing the field. We're doing ethically right thing. So engineers are not always against the thing, and they are thinking through those things sometimes. But there is a contradiction with the like business goals sometimes.
I agree, and that's why I say that that we cannot put more pressure on engineers to learn suddenly about human rights, right? I mean, that's a whole field on itself. But the teaching of collaboration and the sponsorship that has to come from leadership in order to expand this cycle, I think that's necessary if we really want to commit to these values.
Really interesting. Really, really interesting point, actually. And I think we've come a long way from, was it 5 years ago? Google were like, we've got a kill switch, and that's the best we've got. So I think it's really interesting to see these develop. We spent a lot of time focusing on large language models. And actually, I think one of the really interesting emerging use cases are things like small language models and action models, which are much simpler to run on things like laptops, much easier to run in local environments. And I think much more within budget for small companies and startups. You can get these things running for £500, £600 and actually prove some really meaningful insights. What do you guys see as the low-hanging fruit for things like small language models, which might have less ethics association, but actually have their own inaccuracies you have to manage?
Yeah, I think these models used for Copilot, for instance, when you have so many calls and it's something very specific to your code base within your company, and then this is a model that is trained on your data and can give the best suggestions for you. This is for instance, one case. Also for, like, not only for programming, but also document writing, all kind of knowledge tasks. For instance, so we work on a project where there's an automated report generation. So people start writing a report, and they get automated grounding for all the claims they write in the report, grounded on their company data. And for this, many AI agents have to crawl the company data and judge if this information is relevant for this context or not. And for this, you don't need like a super clever model that can all the reasoning tasks. It just has to collect information, and if it finds something, it aggregates or it puts everything together. And then there's a larger model that takes the reasoning on all of these findings, and then can validate or invalidate the claim made in the document.
Really interesting. I think also a very common use case you'll see, like assessing these factors, checking if they're true or accurate, and then returning that to the end user, which I think in itself also forms part of like human-in-loop testing, right? Being able to validate and check your own sources. I think a lot of large language models are actually looking at that as a technique right now, which is really interesting. Anything else to add on small language models?
Yeah, definitely. I think small language models are very interesting in many ways. I think one of the problems in ethics and in governance of digitalization is that a lot of public offices, governmental offices, for example, they're very reluctant in using large language models, right? Because of all of the topics on ethics that we just discussed. So small language models, they become kind of an asset for the public domain, not necessarily on the private domain, and they also become kind of an asset on the globalization of these models. And this is definitely interesting because that may bring an economic and a market shift that we are not necessarily understanding right now, because right now we have humongous large language models that are owned by very specific corporations in very specific localities of the world, right? But with the integration of small language models, you suddenly can create a democratization of the utilization of this technology that we don't have yet. And that can create as well an easier way to manage biases, manage cultural differences, manage market differences. So, I mean, I see it as a very interesting opportunity that we haven't understood yet where it's going. And also another positive topic on that is that if we look at the regulatory aspect, specifically the ones in the United States, is that small language models won't be regulated because they don't get into the definition of systemic harm. So there is a gray number on what is considered large language model and small language model. And if you're under that, then it doesn't go into regulatory, which also helps then with training and etc.
But as far as I understood, the use cases are regulated, right?
But
so if you have a face recognition software and it's a very small model, then it's still not.
That's in Europe.
Okay.
But the regulation in the States, the new regulation coming in the States in California has a different level of regulation because they own the biggest language models in the world. So they have more of a technology level there.
I think that's really interesting. It's a bit like regulating cars by their weight instead of their engine power, right? I think some interesting contrasts you can pull there, but I actually think there's probably a lot of acceleration that can be gained for letting some of these smaller models with smaller weights be able to roam a bit more free. I think the harm in them is probably reduced, and I think actually the opportunities to innovate there are really important as well. Birgitte, it'd be good to get your point of view. What do you think from an art perspective, particularly when you're predicting feature values on these art pieces?
In terms of like in general the models, I think what Camille is saying about the unbiasing the model, this is the one which I find most useful for myself, and this is what we are working a lot on. And I think it's applicable to all the models, including the language model, big and small, because what models do depend on, they're depending on data sets. And it is very often not the model itself that is biased, but the data set. And the bigger is the data set, the more difficult it is to control that it's sampled equally, like depending on the field where you're working. So, of course, if we take like my particular case, since the company is based in Germany, we have a heavily biased, like our data collection is heavily biased towards the German art. But if we are talking about the worldwide situation, German art is probably not the most prominent or the most prolific all over the world. This translates perfectly into the language models, because certain languages, I think the absolute majority, please correct me if I'm wrong, the absolute majority of whatever posts online you find, they're going to be in English language. Maybe closely followed up by Chinese, but I think just by the sheer number of users of the language, it maybe have to be switched around. And of course, if we're working, if somebody is working with like smaller languages, you know, Basque language, whatever, they have a lot of problems with using large language models, because Basque language will be just underrepresented completely there. It will be diluted to non-existence.
So actually, it's beneficial if you also have English training data and you train a model for a certain language. Then it's actually beneficial if you have this English data, because there is a lot of logic that is independent of language, where the model can benefit during training.
Yeah, agreed. Especially if we're talking, I guess, across the Indo-European languages, that those are going to be pretty close.
So I don't see that there's a solution where you have like a small model that is only trained on a certain language. I think then still like a large model would perform better, where it has also seen this certain language training data. So for instance, GPT-4 is quite good also on underrepresented languages, but very small models, probably not so much.
Isn't speech-to-text a good example of that? I think I want to call it the kitchen sink approach, where actually as you have smaller models, good example of this might be M42 by Facebook or Whisper by OpenAI. Actually, the smaller models are monolanguage, and as you get to the larger cases, the structure of sentencing alone is enough to increase the accuracy recall for some of the larger models. Do you think that's probably multimodality, or do you think that's rare use cases?
Yeah, it's of course also with other modalities, not just for text applies here. Now there's this trend of large vision language models that combine image tokens and text tokens, and then also generate image tokens, text tokens, audio tokens, can generate videos and so on. And yeah, so far the trend goes on. Like if you have a larger model, if you have more data, then it's then your performance is better.
Really interesting. I think actually one of the things I keep seeing around at the moment is quantity versus quality. And that's becoming a really interesting debate. What do you guys think of the quantity versus quality debate with training data presently? Is it something where you think it's more about having a smaller, more refined, maybe more labeled data set? Or is actually larger scale web scraping type data sets like current large language models are trained on is the more effective path forward?
Short answer would be it's task dependent.
Both at the same time. So, for instance, our models, we first train on a large corpus that is not high quality training data, but you have hundreds of millions of samples. So we create these embedding models that are used for search. And then there is a second stage where we have much less data, only 1 million text and image pairs. But there the text description is much longer and a bit of higher quality. But then at the end, we only fine-tune on 10,000 samples, but those are hand-curated, high quality, specific for a certain use case, and therefore you have this multiple fine-tuning stages where you have less data over time, but more high quality.
I would like to add an extra dimension to this conversation, and it's I know we talked about it a little bit, so there's this very interesting study that came just after ChatGPT was released. I know you read the story, which is called Which Humans, and it was, I don't know if anybody have read it. It was made in Harvard, and the researchers studied the correlation between ChatGPT and non-weird cultures. Weird cultures meaning Western, educated, rich cultures, which I think the terminology is so interesting that it's called weird versus non-weird cultures. So if we're talking about everything that we're saying, precision, efficiency, blah, 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 and all of this, the further we are from weird cultures, having the United States as the point of reference, the less accurate ChatGPT is. So this is something that is proved right now, and because you say exactly that all of this is, we don't know the source of these models. I know that maybe later we're going to speak about open source LLMs, but the truth is that we don't know the source of these models, even if we want to call them open source. So the topics of transparency, explainability, fairness, where is this coming? It's still a problem that nobody knows in the industry, even though we know the problem exists. So I think, going back to this topic, use case dependent, what is better, the LLM or the large language model? It is use case dependent, right? In some cases, you will find that it will be better for your business, whatever, this large language model and do fine tuning and whatever. In some cases, it won't, because if we know that weird cultures are not represented and there would be high levels of hallucination by adapting a ChatGPT in the Colombian government, right? I mean, because we did the testing and half of the people in the government came out as they were dead. That was very interesting. Then we do have a problem on how to grow these technologies elsewhere.
Anything to add very quickly before we turn around and start asking the audience? Are there any questions from the audience? It's a really good opportunity to get your point picked up by panel experts. Makes our life easier. We can pick up on the open source models. So I think actually open source models have really changed the paradigm that a lot of companies are making their model selection around. I think at the moment, the current pressing question is, why would I go pay for a model when I can have one for free of comparable quality? I think that's the open source value proposition. I also think there's an acceleration argument, which is people can be able to move faster and you can have GitHub work together to try and build a model faster than ChatGPT. What do you guys see? I guess you're really seeing the rubber hit the road.
Yeah, we are an open source company. We publish these models, and for us, it's reputation. So it's a great way of showing that we have the skill of developing these kind of models to also get talents and also get the trust from the community. Because especially those days, it's very hard to get real trust in what you're doing because there's so much misinformation in AI or people that came from crypto and now think, okay, AI is a new field. I should hop on and get as much as possible out of this. And these are not people that are really in the field for many years. So how can you prove you are in this field and you do real research? So you publish your models and therefore you can offer your customers maybe also some other products that are not open source, but that fit very well to the AI you offer. And then there's the question, these proprietary services like ChatGPT or Gemini, how can they even make money with this when I say, oh no, I can just run it on my laptop, why would I bother? Yeah, they discovered this quite early, and they realized we have to give some extra features. At some point, OpenAI said, the model is a product. I'm not sure anymore they have this public statement anymore because there is much more of a product than just the model. They offer fine-tuning. They have special API where you can have custom GPT. You can have this assistant, the structured JSON output format, and so on, making this very, very unique so that people cannot just host it somewhere. For instance, Gemini is the best model when it comes to grounding at the moment. And because it's Google, they have access to all the data and then can provide the ground information. And this is something you cannot get from open source model. And that's why I also think this is the most driving factor of the OpenAI community, because they copy basically everything that was previously hidden behind a paywall. But they don't make the big leaps in new models and new technologies. This is still made by the big companies, but they are kind of forced to do this. And they are really under pressure, because if they don't, then everyone will just use the open source models.
I would say that, again, it's just a business perspective. So there are three possibilities generally. So one can develop something on their own. They can use an open source, or they can pay the license. And then depending on the task, they might go one of those directions. So doing something that's not core for the business is not very likely to be developed then by the company itself. So they will be heavily relying on either the open source version or the paid license. Paid license, I would say, would be paid, and this is what we are doing, if it really speeds up or improves our performance in the key tasks. If it's just a decorative element, like, I don't know, providing the description using the language model, then of course it's going to be an open source solution, because it just comes for free and it doesn't really matter.
I mean, from the safety perspective, it's complex, right? It's a complex scenario, because obviously I mean, there's the opportunity to test, to grow, to have it, you know, in broader scenarios and not be dependent on specific companies to pull that off. And that's interesting, and that's definitely a positive, an opportunity. From the other side, if we are building these open source models, like I said, is it really open source? Maybe we should look for another determination on them. There's some open source level, but it's not really onto the source. And because of that, the risks that they can contribute as well, because we don't know how they're being built on top, and they don't have an accountability framework on the building of these open source models, it can go into the wrong side, right? So, because it's really new, what we are really hoping, at least from the ethics research perspective, is that the open source community understands those risks and they can create better assessments on how to use these models before the incorporation of these models. But this is not there yet. So right now, we cannot assess those risks. And in a way, you know, if something happens, we can now say, okay, it's OpenAI's fault, right? And we can have a legal accountability on the topic. Right now, Meta can say, oh, it's not our model, right? You're just building on top. So I think it is too early in the matter of risk assessment and safety assessment to know where to go. And until the community doesn't understand that and builds on top of that too, I'm not sure.
I think it's really interesting. At the moment, the only defense I see for that is OpenAI are willing to pay your court bills if you get filed against for trademark or copyright theft, which doesn't sound like a solution. Sounds like almost like a guardrail. But I think it's becoming interesting, actually, this copyright conversation. It's becoming ever present. And I think that many people are thinking that the Meta Llama models are a really good example where that currently is entirely trained on public domain data. But actually, Facebook probably have one of the largest data sets that they can enrich that data set with.
And it's sensitive data, because the data they have is pure sensitive data. So, and that brings also a layer of responsibility on building on top of these open source models coming from Meta. So this is what I'm saying. I think we still need to learn on that level, and in order to build really like an open source community that it's really mature and doesn't depend as well on private accountability, for example, or private safety measurements.
So I think actually that's a really interesting point. I think the other really compelling argument with large language models is actually that not only do they not have terms of service that relegate your terms of use, but actually they almost always come with these types of frameworks and recommend you run. So a good example of this would be like Llama's new model comes with Llama Guard, which is a way of it moderating the outputs that come out of the model. It tells you if your outputs could be concerned around making a weapon or any of the particular concerns that it can raise and flag. So I think actually, if I look at companies or organizations that are pushing an ecosystem of tools around the models, actually open source seems to be really ahead of some of the more proprietary providers. What do you guys think?
Well, I think including the clause that it cannot be used if this technology can be used to make a weapon, that's like pretty much nonsensical, because any technology can be used for that, like from very basics. I think this is what everybody is witnessing now with the situations happening in the world, and there's like the dual usage things there everywhere. So it's I think I can hardly imagine a technology which cannot be labeled like this. What would be your take on that?
No, I agree with you. And from the regulatory perspective, I mean, defense is under self-regulation, right? I mean, everything that we have talked right now, it's not even part of the discussion. I mean, we are regulating and having recommendations, whatever, in use cases that absolutely have nothing to do with defense. But I do know that these closures that big techs are having right now in the terms of usage of their technologies. I mean, like I said, I hope the open source community also integrates it too. And if that's the case, then I do see a really big value on the utilization of open source models.
Particularly, I think those benefits can be shared and almost incrementally improved upon. And I think that's part of the benefit is you can stand on the shoulders. And I think particularly with companies like OpenAI, where that was initially their unique value proposition, and they very quickly pivoted into commercial models, I don't think we can say that's what the open source community is always going to be doing and always going to be looking at. But I think for the moment, it's actually probably one of the actors moving maybe not solving the problem, but at least attempting to solve the problem.
And even maybe moving those principles in even more interesting ways, because they see how to implement them, right?
Yeah, I think a good example is, seatbelts didn't come out for tens of years after cars. We didn't realize we had a need for them.
It was a 7-year debate to put a seatbelt on a car. Now, you would never drive a car without a seatbelt or a brake, right?
That's very true, actually. Very, very true. Fantastic. That's all the questions we've got time for. We've probably got a few questions we can sneak in from the audience, if there is any. No? I'll take the one from the left here.
I wanted to ask about the open source models. So let's say we're calling models that are open source, which have the model available, but also the training data. Won't in that case, these companies who are also making the data available are also like open to potential lawsuits, because then you could just look through their data, some company could just look through their data and realize that maybe this is like copyrighted data. And then you're also open to some lawsuits there, because you're training the data on like millions upon billions of data points, and you can't look through every single data point to see if it's copyrighted or not.
I don't have an answer for that. I am not sure.
Yeah, so I think this could be also a reason why a lot of companies don't publish their training data, probably. I mean, they use usually publicly available data. But then when having billions of samples, they didn't go through all of them hand by hand and checked. So I think it was very unlikely that all of these models, or at least some, that there exists one of these large models that has no like proprietary data baked in there. So it just must be. And a lot of companies open source their architecture, as you said, also their code they used for training, but then data, only some few companies. But you could think of publishing a data set that you know was created within your company. So this is something that makes sense when you didn't crawl the internet for it, but maybe you're Zalando or so, and you have some internal data. For instance, they have this public or this well-known MNIST fashion data set that is used by machine learning engineers all over the world for learning purpose. Yeah, this would be a scenario.
And I would also add that size really matters in this case, as in many others. Depending on how big a data set we're talking about, so in our company, we know where the data is coming from. So because we're collecting a lot of it manually, without crawling or anything. And there are many companies who are doing exactly this. It's just the smaller companies and smaller models. They're not likely to display their data sets for different reasons. Not because they will be culpable of stealing some data or some copyright issues, but because it will make vulnerable the whole business.
So really interesting law that almost passed in the UK, I think was about to change all of this, which was books, movies, music, and any actual type of audio, if used in a training set, would be exempt from copyright and Creative Commons. So you'd be able to use a book that someone would be able to buy, but in the context of you training an artificial intelligence, you would actually have that as free domain data that you could use. It didn't end up going ahead. I think actually large-scale organizations who earn money from those products had a lot of concern. But I think there are alternative ways for us to think about it. And I do think the point we're currently pressing in, where companies are afraid to show the data that they're training their model with in case they get sued, is probably a big stifling factor for innovation right now. Any more questions from the audience? Going, gone. Fantastic. The next session is a break, so I think there'll be coffee and refreshments out in the main hall. If you want to grab a chance to have a chat with any of the panelists as well towards the end of the session, they'll be hanging around for a few minutes. Otherwise, thank you very much for joining the session today.